if it isn't another episode of No Franchise Fatigue, your monthly podcast dedicated to examining the cinematic world of franchises. A podcast so dedicated to the idea of sequels, prequels, reboots, remakes, and remakequels that we're actually thinking of remaking this podcast ourselves. Maybe we can get Liev Schreiber to play me. No? No? Your silence is deafening, Sean. All right. Yeah.
I'm not sure he could. I'm not sure he could land your beautiful radio voice. Maybe Gilbert Gottfried.
Oh God! I like it. I like that much better. I like it. So, I am, as we have mentioned, one of your hosts for today. My name is Matt Reifschneider, and I am joined by my semi-psychic and spiritually vengeful co-host, Sean Caylor. How are you doing tonight, Sean?
Got 3 days left. I'm starting to see some freaky stuff, man.
Dude, it's the worst. It's the worst. Do you have a tail though?
Just bailed out on me, man.
And speaking of which, if we are going to remake No Franchise Fatigue, I think maybe you should be played by a blind Vincent D'Onofrio.
Ah, beautiful. I got the beard. He's got the beard.
He's got the beard. Yeah, I'm feeling that. I'm feeling that. Even though I wasn't feeling that so much in one of the films that we're going to be talking about here in a little bit. So, but we'll get to that. So, as we mentioned on our last episode, today for this episode, we are going to be tackling the second part of our expansive Ring universe and looking at most of the non-Japanese versions of Ring, which includes The Ring, The Ring 2, Rings, and as a bonus, the South Korean remake from 1999, The Ring Virus.
In a way, this is our first sequel.
You are correct, sir. It is. It's our second part for a franchise to be tackling. And it's kind of nice because the Ring franchise is pretty nicely split into three parts. You can pretty easily split it into three parts. So we're going to be hitting a whole trilogy here eventually. So, and as we have discussed before, if you want to, listeners out there, our second episode of No Franchise Fatigue, we did tackle the first four Japanese films of the Ring franchise in an episode that's called All's Well That Ends Well, which I think is probably our best episode title we have ever done.
Yep.
Yeah. It's so good. So good. We're going to have to come up with a better pun for this one.
Yeah, I was going to go with well, and it's like, nah. We can do.
I don't know. We could do well. I like that. Well. Or
it's our. I don't know. Well, back to the well feels good.
Yeah, back to the well. Yeah, we could do maybe something with Ring. We could use just the tagline from The Ring too, which is "Fear comes full circle." I think that was the tagline for Ring 2. I'll have to look that up. Now that I said that out loud, I'm not sure that I may have just made that up. I think that's the tagline, but nonetheless, as we are apt to do here, I'm going to throw out a warning right now at the beginning of the episode that we will be disclosing and discussing spoilers galore for all films in this part of the franchise. So if you have not seen them and would like to check them out prior, please feel free to just pause this episode right now. Go rate, review, and subscribe to No Franchise Fatigue wherever you listen to podcasts first, and then go watch movies and come back and finish the episode. You like how I slipped that in?
That was good.
I feel like it was subtle.
It was. Subtle like a Michael Bay movie. Nailed
it. It's subtle like a Michael Bay movie. I knocked out 3 teeth with how subtle that was, but we're going to run with it. So today we're going to be talking about the American films and the South Korean film for the Ring franchise. This is obviously where I would probably think that most of our listeners are most familiar with this franchise is going to be this episode. And even so, I think this is kind of where we got our start with the Ring franchise.
Certainly. Absolutely was for me. A lot of firsts in this franchise for me. The Ring was just a very big early love of mine. Saw it in theaters and was instant. It was one of those things that was life altering in the sense that it made me realize how good a horror movie could be. Because at that point, I mean, not to disparage the genre I love so much, but I was still fairly young and mostly, focused on slashers and the stuff of my childhood, 80s, and I hadn't really elevated to more artful kind of horror. Not to call it a art film, it's definitely a mass market horror film, but and we'll get more into it when we actually get into it. But it definitely made me realize how good they can be, and by God, it showed me that a PG-13 movie can be terrifying.
For sure, and I think that's such a key part of it, especially for people our age, that and even for some people younger, that The Ring, when it came out in 2002, posited itself as a PG-13, so it was widely available, in a lot of ways, and yet it was still incredibly scary. So a lot of the times when I talk to people and I tell them, hey, you know what, I'm a film journalist, I'm a film critic, and and they're like, oh, what kind of movies? And I say, I cover a lot of genre films, horror movies, martial arts films, action films, things like that. And they're like, horror movies, they're like, oh, The Ring is so scary. It's like notoriously one of the first movies they bring up because it was at an age where they get hit with it because it is completely terrifying, but it was an easily accessible film for a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Um,
and and for me, it was part of me. Got to see this film in 2002, and when it came out, it stuck with me. It was a film that hit me hard. It was a film that once I started doing research, I started digging in and found all the Japanese films. I mean, I'm pretty sure I was the one that kind of pushed for this franchise for us to really focus on. It's one of my favorite horror franchises to talk about because there's a lot of unique and fascinating things about it. And it's this film I can say that this is the film that kicked it off for me. This is what kind of kicked off a lot of my love for ghost stories and things like that.
yeah, fair. Um, Also, just in weird postscript before we get into the first movie, The Ring 2, first time I ever experimented with mind altering drugs. Ring 3 was the first movie I ever saw in D box. Just a whole
Oof.
franchise of firsts for me.
D box? You wouldn't saw Rings in D box?
Of all damn movies, but yeah.
Mm. We'll have to talk a little bit more about how D-Box affected you during that film, because I'm really curious now, because that's a strange film to see in D-Box. So,
Spoiler alert, best movie I've ever seen in D box. Furious.
uh,
No,
uh,
yeah, Fate of the Furious, absolutely.
oh really?
Oh yeah, think about it. Car movie.
That's true. I'll
Basically,
give you that.
anything with a lot of car scenes is really good for.
What?
Anyway,
Yeah, I'm not even sure we have a D-Box out where I live.
we've only got like three, and I'm in the heart of LA. I mean,
Right, right, yeah, yeah. That's something that I'm not even sure. I've never been in a D-Box theater before to see a movie. Something I've always wanted to try, but I'm kind of happy just watching a movie. So
it's fair.
so there it is. But I think that this is a good place for us to kind of just jump right in to The Ring as we're starting to talk about that. This was kind of our first experience with it. So for those of you out there who may not know what The Ring is, which would be a shock because I feel like this movie was seen by everybody and their mom and their family dog saw this film. But if you must know, the synopsis for The Ring kind of runs like this. Released in 2002, directed by Gore Verbinski. The Ring kind of goes over the story of Rachel and her son. Rachel is an investigative journalist who, by happenstance of one of her family members being killed by a cursed videotape, stumbles into this huge conspiracy about a tape that if you watch it 7 days later, you get yourself killed. So it's a VHS tape that you watch. She starts investigating it, stumbles upon a very sad story about a little lonely girl named Samara in this franchise, and ends up finding out that Samara herself is this vengeful ghost who is looking to strike out against those who essentially wronged her in life, and and enlists the help of an ex-boyfriend husband slash character. We're never really clear what that full relationship is there. he helps out. He's kind of a video nerd, helps her out with it as they investigate. Pretty soon, their whole family is cursed by this videotape, and there is a timeline for them to solve Samara's untimely death before they all die at her hands. Literally, her hands are fingernail-less hands. I don't think I've ever said the word fingernail-less before, but no, it's a good. I don't even know if it's a real word, but fingernail-less hands. So that's that. That's the essence of The Ring.
And it's an interesting movie to talk about, especially in a remake sense, because this is a rare case where I do prefer the American version, and the reason why is the Japanese version does presume a certain amount of fear of Uri being inherent, fear of a angry ghost being kind of inherent. We don't have that cultural supposition in the same way. So this is actually what an American remake should be. You just replace the cultural suppositions with American ones, and you kind of play out the same thing, or you change it where it needs to be. And that's exactly what this remake does. It changes what needs to change to make it an American film, and otherwise just kind of leaves it alone. Lets it breathe in its own way.
Absolutely. I think that's an incredibly accurate statement to make. Now, as I mentioned in our first episode on the Ring films, the first Ring film from 1998 is one of my top horror films of all time. I adore that film to no ends, and I cannot argue with you on any of those statements. I think this might be one of the best remakes I have ever seen, simply because you're right. It's a movie that takes the heart and essence of what Ring was as a film and then transposes it to an American sensibility in a lot of different ways, including being a little bit more upfront and expository with its dialogue, or looking to expand some of the cultural context to an American place, including using a horse farm as part of it, which is something I always forget. When every time I watch this movie, I'm always like, damn it, there is a horse thing. There's a whole horse subplot to this movie I forget about.
Yeah, and I think on top of that, boy, it's just scary. They kind of come to the tape from a different angle, or how it's filmed is from a different angle, in that it's just more overtly disturbing. The tape in this movie, Gore Verbinski really needs help, and I want to give him a hug. No.
No,
No,
I think
really, it is interesting in that not every element of the tape ties into Samara's story necessarily, which is kind of cool. The elements that need to do, her stepmother or adoptive mother, I suppose, in the mirror and such. But then you've got stuff like just a ladder. It's creepy.
it's incredibly creepy, incredibly creepy. I think in general, and we'll talk a little bit more about the tape here in a second, but in general, I think this film is a little bit more upfront with everything that it's doing. It's not, we talked a lot about the original Ring being a film that's very vague, and as you said, posits that its audience already has a basic understanding of a lot of the cultural elements in that film. And as a Westerner, it's hard to take the original Ring in those regards. But this film definitely plays things a little bit more on its sleeve. Now, I've heard stories that they had to edit quite a bit out of this movie because there was some disturbing content to get it down to a PG-13 level. And I've also heard stories that the videotape itself, that when Gore Verbinski and his staff were trying to create the cursed videotape and what would be on there, that they did hundreds of different edits of that tape, trying to make it so that there is no initial visible narrative to that tape. As you mentioned, there's scenes in it that don't necessarily relate, although they do later on. Things like the
The note
fly,
comes to mind. Yeah.
yeah, or the fingernail with the nail being pulled off. Which, as I mentioned before, Samara actually doesn't have any fingernails because she pulled them all off trying to get out of the well. But so there's things that connect almost tonally, but not necessarily our scene for scene shots, which is something that many of the sequels, as they start introducing new elements to the tape, don't do very well. That this movie does incredibly well.
I think I really like Aiden, who is the kid. The reporter Rachel, played wonderfully by Naomi Watts, by the way. And we should definitely mention, not a lot of names in this cast, but everybody is definitely putting in an A+ performance.
Yes. The casting of this is really interesting because in doing my research for this, because Naomi Watts has always been a person that I've understood as being like kind of an A-list star. I guess at the time that this film was, that she really wasn't. And it
Most
sounds
of the
like,
time, yeah.
yeah, it sounds like Gore Verbinski intentionally cast a lot of people that weren't necessarily recognizable, even going down to Brian Cox, who plays Samara's adopted father for a short sequence in this movie. It's not like he's a household name at this point, even though he's been he's a fantastic character actor and been in hundreds of films and things like that. But
Yeah.
I was under the understanding that they cast her simply because she kind of wasn't a known name.
Yeah, this predates X2. Yeah, yeah.
hmm Yeah, yeah. Briefly, very briefly, it predates X2. This was kind of the beginning of Brian Cox's resurgence. We've talked about
I always knew. I mean, I always know him from Mindhunter, of
right,
course.
or Long Kiss Goodnight or things like that. But they're always kind of smaller roles, these smaller kind of side roles that he does. He always absolutely
You're
nails.
a collector, sir.
Yeah, he's very versatile. But I was looking through, there's an interesting list that I found online. Now, granted, you can only trust things that you find online as far as you can throw a dead cat. But, some of the names that were thrown around for people considered for the role of Rachel before it went to Naomi Watts was Jennifer Connelly, Jennifer Love Hewitt, Gwyneth Paltrow, and Kate Beckinsale.
Yeah, I think they went the right way.
I think so too. I think Naomi Watts and when we get to
Jennifer Connelly's the only interesting name on that list for me for this role.
interestingly enough, though, she also starred in another J horror remake called Dark Water, and the original Dark Water is from the director of the original Ring. So she ended up that comes full circle. We're talking about full circles here. Um, Jennifer Connelly.
The Dark Water novel by the same guy too, Koji Suzuki.
Yes, yes. The novel itself, though, is a series of short stories. Oddly enough, I actually just pulled out that novel a couple of weeks ago because I wanted to reread a couple of the short stories in it. So one of the short stories is Dark Water, which is what the movie is based on. So
Okay.
yeah, yeah, and it's actually very, very good. So to go along with the points that I wanted to make with The Ring, especially like what this film could have been, was, as I mentioned before, when the producers purchased the rights to this movie, they tried to shop it around a lot. And producer Neil Edelstein, who had the rights to this film, was looking at a lot of different directions. We talked a little bit about the different stars that were different lead actresses that were looking for The Ring and things like that. But I guess one of the initial offers he threw out there was for a different director rather than Gore Verbinski. He actually offered the remake to David Lynch, and David Lynch turned it down. Supposedly. Now this is also internet rumor, so let's keep it honest and upfront, but that I read that one time and now I think a lot about that. I know you're a huge David Lynch fan, so I felt like, especially when I started as we were doing kind of research on this, I was like, oh, I have to bring that up for Sean's sake. I got to bring this up.
So, true story. As soon as you say that, I can immediately visualize what David Lynch's Ring would be and not be. Because it's easy to forget David Lynch has made straightforward movies and not just one or two. Like he's won Oscar, but he won an Oscar on a straightforward movie.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting in my head because when I think about David Lynch doing The Ring, it actually makes me feel like the original Ring is pretty Lynchian in a lot of ways.
It is, but first and foremost, can you just imagine what that tape would look like?
No, actually, I don't want to. I'm going to block that from my memory. Nope, 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 nope.
If any of our listeners ever really want to have a just joyous 20 bizarre freaking minutes, look up on Netflix, What Did Jack Do? It's
That's
like,
his new short one, right?
yeah, he'd shown it at a couple of festivals for the last few years, but he just made it widely available for the first time on Netflix. And yes, What Did Jack Do? Go in as cold and blind as humanly possible. It is an experience.
I haven't watched it yet. In fact, I'm weirdly blind. David Lynch has a lot of blind spots for me in general, but riddle me this, Batman. Didn't David Lynch like highly negate Netflix in the streaming environment and watching movies on your phone prior to
Um,
this? Wasn't he like staunchly against it? I can't remember if that was him or not.
uh, yes, it is, and you're right. But it's not that he's against the concept of streaming. You know, any reasonable person would just call that the evolution of cable and whatever. It is specifically the sub point you made about watching it on small, tiny phone screens and stuff. That's what he
Right.
against, which is reasonable and not uniquely Lynchian. You know, one could argue Nolan is kind of in the same camp on that.
At this point, Nolan doesn't even like people watching it on normal theater screens.
Yeah, like 7 millimeter IMAX. It is the only format.
For sure. But like there's a lot of directors that kind of go obviously like Steven Spielberg just, last year before was staunchly against Netflix being considered as real movies. Like so he kind of came out against that, but
As it got reported literally days later that he had signed a deal with Apple Plus.
yeah, I know, right? So good. The hypocrisy is so strong in this area.
Although, you know, like, stop asking 70s filmmakers about modern, like, pop culture. It's moved past what they're interested in, and what they're interested in is still valid, which is why they're still making movies.
I mean, as far as I'm concerned, when movies started adding in sound, I was done. That's not real cinema. I'm
Ex-
sorry, the talkies, go fuck yourself.
But it's like, for the just last 15 years of Ebert's life, after he got into the games aren't art argument, he had to fight that fight the rest of his life. And it's like, the dude's 70. Yeah, he's never going to consider a video game art. Get over it.
So,
So,
yeah, everything evolves. Everything evolves, which is very Lynchian in its own way. And also why I do feel like bringing this back around, a Lynch version of Ring.
it would have been, oh, like I said, don't wanna drill in too far on this point, you know, especially as it was a rumor. But boy, you can just visualize what that would have been. It'd have been something. Laura Dern would have definitely been the lead.
Well, and like you said, it is a rumor and things like that. And it could have been that, they offered it up and he didn't even like read a script or anything. You know what I mean? Like I'm sure they offered it to 50 directors like that or whatever. He just happened to be a name that had popped up. But like I said, it was his name being connected with it that because I do feel like some of the movies I've seen, there's a lot of themes in continuity or in connection with what the Ring series does. And I think that would be really interesting. So but yeah, the cast in this is stacked. It's got a pretty stacked cast. I know you said you really liked the little boy in it. He's actually, in my part, the least effective part of this movie.
So I mean in the sense of I like his characterization. I think the actor is a little more iffy, but and it's the only one. But you know, it's a child actor. What are you gonna do? He's not
Exactly.
bad, but um, he's creepy in the right ways. And I think it's an interesting dynamic, and you know, considering how forgettable the kid is in the Japanese version, at least Aiden's memorable character.
Yeah. Well, and they increase him as a a relative factor. He's not in the original Japanese one. The little kid is more or less, until the sequels, is more or less a plot point for the first film. In this one, they increased that in this film, one of the larger changes that they make from the original to this remake is that instead of the husband being clairvoyant, it's the kid that has these almost psychic abilities where he's drawing pictures of his cousin's demise at the hands of Samara a week before it happens,
Yeah.
or his weird connection with Samara in some way, which is played up in sequels. But he's given much more to do here, and he's much more of a character versus a plot progression, which is interesting. It's a good change, I think, for this film.
So, what do you think of the ending? Because I know it's similar to the Japanese on a point by point, but I think Samara, at least at this point, is more overtly evil than Sadako was in the first movie. Anyway, and I do only mean that in the sense that, because obviously it's the same twist in both, but I don't know. I've just always felt the Japanese Ring had more of a sense of tragedy to it, where it's a more justified anger. Whereas Samara, I mean, no matter how many times they've tried to make her backstory tragicer and tragicer, I'm coining that word now,
Fair
more
enough.
and more tragic.
Trademarked.
um, her response is always just so much worse, and she's like almost like wickedly evil in this. And uh I always thought it was kind of funny they basically gave her Reagan. I made the joke last episode, but they did basically give her Reagan from Exorcist makeup.
And a lot of makeup. I guess it took like 3 hours or something to put on all the makeup. So I read that somewhere. Um, well, and this is also one of the reasons I actually don't love The Ring as much as I like Ring. The Ring versus Ring. So,
Right.
for clarification, for versus the original one, is that I think you're absolutely right. The character is portrayed as more vicious, as more imposing in a lot of ways. And part of that is that they show her more. They're willing to show her, especially at the end, you get to see her face. Whereas in the original one, you saw her eye, which is a more artful touch. But in this one, being very much more of an American appeal, they want to kind of show it to you, at least at the end. And so you get to kind of see her, especially in the scene where she comes after the father slash husband figure. When she comes out of the TV, which is what everyone remembers, it's a frightening sequence, and they fully show her, and in the way they digitize her to make her look like she has a little bit of like white noise, like TV fuzz over her
Such
look. So good, so good. But they show her full face, and they give her like this super evil looking makeup and things like that, versus the original one where she's just looks insane and wet, like.
It's not just Samara, even though that's the easy one to point to, but also the death that she gives. In the movies, it's a heart attack and they have a scared look on their face, but in this, it's like distorted, like it's a special effect in this case.
Yeah, they almost look like they're dried out, like a dried husk, like all the water's been taken from their body, which I think was probably intentional. For sure. It also leads to the fact that it gives the film immediately a supernatural bend.
Yeah.
When you see the look of the girl in the closet when they discover that she has passed away from
Well,
the initial
Rachel
attack.
is a reporter, and this movie does have the investigative tint. Like you say, it's much more overtly. She's more malicious and has more kind of imposes on the movie more because, like, there's haunt scenes that just don't exist in the Japanese version. Um, the horse on the ferry, for example. You mentioned the horse farm, because the Japanese movie's more specifically paced. You've always said it's more about mood and tone, and this is more out and out just a horror movie.
Yeah,
It
and
strikes an interesting mood and it has a great tone, but it is an out and out horror movie.
right, and even and I swear that horse scene will always be unintentionally funny to me. Just seeing I mean,
The
it's
horse,
sad. The CGI horse like going over the bow of a ferry and then being so it doesn't really show it, but you get the idea. It was chopped up by the propellers and by the blood that you see going in the ocean. It's weirdly unintentionally funny to me. I like the idea of the horse farm though. It's very American. This idea of a ranch and the isolation that comes with it. So
now, what do you think of Brian Cox and kind of Samara's tragic backstory?
I mean I like the tragic backstory here. It's obviously as with everything in this film, it's a lot more defined than in the original one. Especially, I mean, we covered the first four films in the other ones. So we got a prequel in Ring Birthday that kind of explained Sadako's backstory. But here, Samara, you get a lot more of that. It's interesting because you get this idea that Brian Cox is a kind of a tough asshole in this, and then to see when she brings up Samara, like the fear in his eyes, and
Mm-hmm.
about like he makes the comment about how she just never slept, she never sleeps, and like you get this. I mean, he owns that sequence in there. I think the backstory itself, I like it. I don't necessarily love it because I'm less is more. So sometimes I would have been okay that you didn't have to explain everything. I'm okay if you didn't.
Less isn't more, less is less. The more the better, the most the best. Yeah, I went lordy on you, sir.
Yeah. This is true. I can't believe you just quoted that to me. That's ridiculous. Um, I mean, but the backstory is interesting. I mean, Brian Cox is great. What I do like about the Brian Cox sequence in this movie is his death sequence, where he electrocutes himself in the bathtub to get away from Samara because he's like, she's out now. He's like, there's no hope. There's no hope. I might as well kill myself. But it also feeds into the one of the major themes that we'll talk about at the end. But it's something that I do like to bring up here because this film really, really hammers it home in a really nice way. Is the kind of the fear of technology that's imported from the original series,
Mm-hmm.
and it's in some ways kind of funny on how much it uses that fear of technology in weird ways, including the Brian Cox death sequence where he electrocutes himself in the tub. Not even just like a toaster. No, he has like 7,000 plugs with TVs and fans and all this other electronic. It's like this whole contraption he electrocutes himself with. But also to the point where there's a great scene early on in the film when she is starting to put together the pieces that watching the tape will curse you, and that you have that 7 days. She's putting it all together, and she looks outside of her balcony window. She lives in this high rise in Seattle, and we'll talk a little bit more about the visuals of Seattle, which makes this movie great. But she looks out the balcony and she sees everybody watching televisions across the apartments, across the way, and everybody's in front of the television. And it's this sweeping shot where it cuts to like apartment to apartment, and it's in the film never says it, but you get this idea of like, oh, if this gets out, this is it. This is the end. This everybody's doomed. And so there's that, and then even in a more heavy-handed way, when they finally uncover the well and they rip up the floorboards of the cabin and the well, it's literally a TV that knocks her into the bottom of the well. The TV slides down the boards. It's like so heavy-handed, but I appreciate it because I like that Gore
Well,
Verbinski's threading this in.
and speaking of heavy-handed, but I think effectively so, instead of just letting the audience realize that Samara was evil the whole time, that shot of Aiden being like, which he goes, "Yeah, we helped her," and he's like, "You what?"
Exactly. I actually wrote that down because I think that line is phenomenal where he literally like looks at her and he's like, "You helped her? You set her free?" Like, and there's like a fear in his voice. That is a great reveal to reveal that Samara doesn't give a shit about being saved. She just gives a shit about punishing everyone that did all of these awful things to her, and isolated her. I also like that the movie, when they go into her backstory, stepping back to your question about that, she lives in the top of the barn,
Mhm.
and you get to see her little room with it. And Gore Verbinski shoots that sequence so incredibly well because you have the only thing that's in her room that's like her friend is the television set. And there's like this tiny little kid's chair that's empty, that's just sitting there. And you immediately get this idea of her being isolated and alone in this situation and just watching TV. So it then almost makes sense that when she's thrown down the well and the cabin is built above it, that she can reach out and burn these images, because they explain that she's able to burn images onto film when she stays at the psychiatric hospital, that she's able to burn these images onto videotapes because television is what she understands. And I think that's a really, really, really good layering in this film to go with that technology aspect, but to also go into Samara's backstory.
You did mention Seattle, and I do actually think that's worth mentioning. What a setting. What a great choice. And that's not even just coming from a native Seattleite, although won't say that didn't make the movie scarier.
So good. Well, I mean, Seattle's the perfect American place to put this movie. Now, I had read originally in the script it was based in Maine, because I guess they wanted to just replicate Stephen King for a while. But I like the idea of putting it in Seattle because you still get that island feel from the original one with the islands off the coast, but you get that and yeah. Oh, and Gore Verbinski just cakes on the atmosphere, that gray atmosphere. He coats the film in a kind of a gray green tone the entire time, which is also very early 2000s. A lot of movies were doing that, but I actually think of all the movies that I've ever seen that kind of desaturate color or anything, I think it works best for this film simply because it's raining all the time, and with a theme of water. That's fantastic that there's like all this kind of rain and this idea that the water's always there, along with that sickly feel to the movie with this gray green tone. And you can tell he did it in post production because on my Blu-ray for The Ring, there is a behind the scenes featurette with interviews with people and stuff like that. And they show footage in this featurette. I think it was shown on like HBO or something. In the footage on the featurette, everything is in full color. There's no desaturation. And so like you get to see like Naomi Watts with her bright blonde hair, and you get to see like the tree that's on fire and it's like this bright red. So you can tell that that was a decision made in post, and I actually think it was a really good decision.
Also, speaking of that ferry scene you like so much, this came out in 2001, and I don't know about Maine, but in New York, post 9/11, they don't allow cars on ferries anymore. It is purely foot traffic only. So this horse scene becomes timeless because it's in one of the last places that has vehicle ferries.
Oh, that's really, I did not know that. Yeah, because this came out in October of 2002. So this would have been like one of the last films probably to showcase that.
Yeah.
Um, and I guess outside of the one vehicle that shows up in that Spider-Man movie in Homecoming, so where it's just a person ferry. So, oh, that's really interesting. So I did not know that.
Just realized that makes that sequence in Spider-Man: Homecoming like wildly inaccurate because that took place 5 years ago.
Yeah, and there's only a few cars in that sequence if memory serves right, but it's mostly foot traffic or whatever. But and it makes you wonder if it's something else. So
Yeah, it makes you realize it was shot in Toronto.
yeah,
Um,
fair enough.
but I digress.
And I do want to mention
Oh,
one
please,
more thing
please.
that's I find really interesting about The Ring. As we mentioned, release date. So it was released in October of 2002. I think DreamWorks, who's the studio that released this film, and Gore Verbinski did something really really interesting by using its release date. Is it actually didn't open up wide initially. That they opened it up in smaller amounts of theaters in early October, like October, I think it was like 18th through 20th or whatever, and then widen the release the next week for Halloween. So it's actually one of those films that had a much, much larger second weekend than it did the first because they wanted to capitalize on Halloween, but they intentionally did a smaller release because they wanted word of mouth to spread. They had so much faith in this movie that they actually skewed its release to do so. And I had read that in the commercials leading up to its release, they would actually just show clips of the cursed videotape with no information about a movie. that they wanted to create almost its in kind of a post Blair Witch Project world, wanted to create kind of its own urban myth around the videotape, which, to be honest, when this movie came out, the story of this movie, like in my school, spread around like it was real. Like the idea of that you watch a videotape in 7 days you die. So I think that's a really cool way that they marketed this movie, and I think that it leads really, really well into how to watch this movie.
And the reason I'm just rolling forward so hard is the next movie on our docket is, of course, The Ring Virus, which is the Korean remake of The Ring. So allow me to synopsize this in double time.
We're going to talk about the same plot one more time.
So, following the death of her niece, journalist Hong Soon-ju follows the trail of her niece to a cabin where she comes across a cursed videotape, and she watches it, realizes she has 7 days, although in this case, because the tape explicitly says so in text on screen, and brings in her ex-husband to help investigate. Her daughter, in this case, watches the tape. They rush to figure it out, make a copy. She survives. Everybody else dies. We know how this goes. I'm actually half kidding. It's only really interesting to talk about this movie in the sense of what's different and why I wanted to put it immediately after the American Ring remake before we hit the sequels is just because this is more diversion than anything. We've seen the story at this point. I think the interesting things to talk about here are the tape in and of itself, and just kind of how this story, in a weird way, was a good guideline for Gore Verbinski to work with, because it feels like this straddles the difference between the two movies almost perfectly.
This is a fascinating movie in a lot of ways. You're absolutely right. Simply because, number one, this movie only came out 1 year after the original Ring, and Spiral came out in Japan. It's co-produced by Japan as a way to like build those bridges between the two industries and things like that. And I think that's a really interesting idea that it's literally 1999. This comes out. Ring comes out in 1998. Gore Verbinski's The Ring comes out in 2002. So within the span of 4 years, we have three versions of this movie that get released.
And if you back
And
in 1995, there was the TV movie also.
there
So
was the TV movie that was made originally, which is I've yet to watch.
I've never
I
seen it. Yeah.
I do have a very questionable copy of that movie, of the original one, but I've heard that my copy is not very good. I've always taken a look at it and I'm like, oh, I'll watch it later. That's the thing. Maybe we'll do that as a bonus on our next episode of Ring, just to try to cap it all off and make sure we get one more synopsis of the story out
Yeah.
there for a remake. But
I almost thought about going all in, but
yeah, just
um, so one thing I will say that I was actually shocked, because you're the one that, just real life behind the scenes. Matt's the one that taught me this movie even existed. Like, I learned of this movie's existence like 2 months ago. And it's very hard to see. It took a lot of effort to watch this. But one of the things I found really, really fascinating is I believe this is the first version, at least of this original Ring story, that out and out points out that in this movie it's Unsu, which I'm probably desperately mispronouncing that name. Obviously, I have a lot of trouble with Korean names. We learned in the Revenge Trilogy episode, where she's a hermaphrodite, and that's actually a major plot point in this movie. It's why she's killed.
Yes, and that's a major point in this. And the film itself and the makers of this film very much state that it's a new version of the book, not a remake of Ring. They tried to make that very clear in a lot of ways. I've read that in a ton of places,
And it is
but
very similar to the book.
it,
It cuts the element of smallpox, but that's a really hard concept to translate to.
yeah, as we discussed on our previous episode with Spiral, how they tried to bring that dark science fantasy science element into that film, and how audiences just flat out rejected it. And
Rejected.
like,
Oh,
yeah,
yeah.
despite the fact that I think that film does it pretty well, that audiences
It was
just
a
did
new
not buy.
discovery of mine. I actually love that. It's my favorite of the Japanese series so far.
Yeah, and this one does it follows the I have not read the book. Obviously, we talked about this last time, but I've not read the book. From what I gather, it does follow the book more closely, but it does obviously pull inspiration from the Japanese Ring film. Also,
Changing the
by
gender of the protagonist.
yep, yep, exactly, having a female protagonist as a who's investigating. There's even a couple of scenes. I just rewatched this last week. There's a couple of scenes in this that are pretty much verbatim from the Japanese one, the Japanese original film. So it's an interesting idea that this film so closely to the original remakes it.
This is the only one besides the original novel and the second movie where the X character is just a complete son of a bitch.
Oh, he's such a dick in this movie, and the actor who does it really well. And so like I'm like I don't know if I've ever seen another movie with him or not, but every time I watch this movie, I'm always like, God, he's such a dick. Like I can't believe and I just associate him with it. So
Yeah, definitely. The only other thing I want to mention is I think the tape in this movie is interesting because it's got this musical seed that it's just like really upbeat and cheerful, and it's almost off-putting in a bad way until that links in weirdly in the ending, and it turns out to be like Enso's music box from when she was a child, and it's like I gotta admit that kind of worked for me at the end of the day, but boy, it's off-putting initially.
it's super off-putting. I think the video in this and mentioning the video because we talk a lot about how the curse videotape in each of these versions is very different. I like that this one actually spells out things. In the beginning, it even says "watch until the end." That's at the beginning of the tape that it says that, which almost spurs you further to be like, "What's at the end?" It's the same thing that people do now with viral videos. They're like, "Oh, wait till the end," so that you watch
The the instructions on how to save yourself being cut off is actually from the book. And this is the only version that did that because it's the only one that puts the text on screen, literally spelling it out.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting too, because I like that it cuts off the thing like there's something taped over it, and you're like, oh, which is such a VHS problem. Like that was such a first world problem in the VHS days. Was accidentally I personal story here. I swear to God, it wasn't until like 5 years ago that I actually saw the very end of Return of the Jedi. Like I had no idea that Darth Vader was burned on a funeral pyre at the end of that movie, and I just spoiled Return of the Jedi. Let's hope everybody have seen that. But I know, right? So I
Luke's
had
father, Darth Vader.
I know, yeah, right. I had no idea he was burned at a funeral pyre, and you get to see the Force Ghost at the end because the copy we had taped from like HBO or whatever, the next movie started before Return of the Jedi ended, so I never got to see the end credits. And I remember the first time I watched it, I bought it on DVD or whatever when I was in college, and I was watching it. And I was like, oh my God, there's a whole like another three sequences at the end of this movie I've never seen before.
At
So
least you at least got to see the ending in the theatrical when it was still the original Yub Nub song because I adore that.
But yeah, I totally get why like cutting off the message at the end actually kind of makes sense in the days. And I'm sure people listening to this podcast will be like, VHS, I don't understand. Enough so that even in we'll get to a funny comment that's made in the Ring 2 about VHS. But for the most part, this movie is pretty close. Like you said, it straddles that line of being between the Japanese Ring version and Gore Verbinski's The Ring film. It explains a little bit more. It's not nearly as vague as the Japanese one, but it's still much more vague than Gore Verbinski's one. Like you said, it's literally like right there. It's a great stepping stool if you want to understand this story in full to watch the Japanese one, then watch the Korean one before rewatching your remake. So for the American one.
That's a really really good point because in straddling that line, it is a little more explicit with a few things, and I think it might be the easiest entry point to the Asian kind of version of this story.
In and it might even be the most, if memory serves right, the most explicit version of this story Outside of maybe the original TV one, because the original TV one I heard was almost borderline softcore pornography at times, in that it leaned into kind of the exploitation aspects of the film. But in this one, um, our our antagonist, Yun Su, or Unsu, again, I'm going to butcher all these names too. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry to everybody out there. In this one,
Yeah, I'm sorry.
well, in this one, she's also an adult
Mhm.
versus a child, which is in both of the other films. They kind of make her a younger person, around 12 or something. And this one, she's an adult and she's actually raped before she's thrown down the well. And it's also incestuous ways. It's by her half brother, if memory serves correct.
Yes, it was.
Um, so this one's a little bit more extreme in those regards too, even with her story, which, if it, you kind of understand her anger even more so in this one. If in Gore Verbinski's, she's kind of more sinister, evil kid. This one, she's just a pissed off ghost, and so you kind of feel that. And from what I gather, those are both things that happened in the book too. So it does keep it closer to the book in those regards.
Like I said, more of a diversion in the sense of this conversation, but definitely worth mentioning and honestly worth watching. It's something to seek out. Actually, it's pretty darn good movie in its own right.
Yeah,
Uh,
I quite enjoyed it, and it needs to get a good release. I hope somebody, with all of these new distribution labels that are grabbing these, foreign films or something, I hope that Arrow Video or somebody grabs this version of it, because it is something that I think is really interesting, even as a side note towards this franchise.
well, with Parasite winning an Oscar, I think we're gonna get a little K horror craze going here pretty soon.
Oh, and there is so many great K horror films that exist out there that, like, Tartan Asian Extreme label put out, things like that that desperately need like new Blu-ray releases. So I really hope that Parasite winning the Oscar opens a lot of doorway for these movies to get better releases in the US, or Korean cinema in general, because there's a lot of great stuff out there. I would kill to have some great copies of movies that only got DVD releases here in the US. So for my collection, because I'm a collector. So gotta
So
collect, gotta catch them all.
get our let's get our mindset back in the American movies. Her name's Rachel. The kid's name's Aiden. Boom! Please tell us all
Boom.
about your favorite movie in the whole wide world, The
This
Ring
is
2.
it's baffling that this movie is as bad as it is, but we'll get to that in a second. The Ring 2 follows up Rachel and her son as they move down to Oregon, because I guess if you're going to get away from evil spirits, you just going to go across the border, the state border.
It's about 800 miles. Yeah.
Yeah, like it's not. You would expect them to like move to Texas or something like that, but no. They decide to move to Oregon to start a new life. She's the editor of the local paper at a small town now, and as it so happens, there is a new ring circle that is going around with young people who are challenging each other to watch the curse tape in an effort to, as a challenge, a Charlie challenge, if you will, to spur on the evil ghost of Samara. And this ghost finds its way into this little town in Oregon, and pretty soon Samara realizes that, I guess she realizes that Rachel and her son are there. She makes a comment about it at one point. She's like,
You,
"I have found you finally," and you're like, "What?" Anyway, we're getting ahead of ourselves here. I need to finish the synopsis. And so Samara finds them, and then in the second half of the movie, Samara has now taken possession of Aiden's body. The movie shifts tone, becomes a child possession film, and it's about Rachel trying to get Samara out of her son and back into the netherworld.
so, first note offhand, this is directed by
Hideo Nakata.
who was the director of the original Japanese Ring. So that's
And the original Ring 2.
yeah,
And
significantly better.
he returns back to the franchise after this for the most recent film, which is under the title Sadako, which just got a release in Japan in 2019. It's the latest version. It just got I believe I have it on pre-order, the Blu-ray from Japan. Let's hope it has English subs.
So, boy, I'm gonna be honest. All I've got to say is pretty lambasting for this film. There's very, very little that I like here. The little boy that plays Aiden is significantly better in this movie, and that is actually worth noting. He's like probably the best part of this film.
For sure. He's steps up a lot. And I like in this movie they really hammer home his similarities with Samara, with his ESP abilities, and then even when they show flashbacks to Samara in this one, they kind of make her look like him. She's got the really deep set dark circles under her eyes. She had that a little bit in the first film, but they really kind of try to build that parallel a little bit better in this film, which I do appreciate.
Stupid move number one. They
Of
they
7,000 moves.
take this really, really good foundation of Samara's backstory, which is more explicit but still relatively vague. You know, she's adopted and all this other stuff. And they just take that little vagary away. And now we know she was adopted out of this orphanage, and her mother was there, and her mother tried to kill her as a baby. And that's why she's so afraid of water. Or actually, she was always afraid of water because she didn't even like to take baths. It was the only time she ever cried.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Ooh, water. Um, to this day though, I'm terrified of water too, so I feel for Samara there. I want to do note, yes, you're correct on this 100%. It's a stupid move. You will see from now on, every time we chat about this film and the next film, Rings, we're going to talk about how these films make a really stupid idea that they feel like to go forward, they must go backwards. And so to move the plot forward, they have to go back even further into Samara's backstory. And so this one does explain her mother, Evelyn, at the orphanage. Um, for the record, Evelyn is played by Sissy Spacek in this
Which
movie,
is cool.
which interesting idea, not utilized at all the way it should have been. And
It makes
also,
the next movie super awkward because that looks
come to
nothing like Sissy Spacek.
yeah, right. And then also come to find out that in the unrated version of this film, there's a bunch of scenes that were cut for the rated version. In the unrated versions of this film, there is more flashbacks to Evelyn, Samara's mother, as a kid. And you want to take a wild guess who plays Evelyn as a kid in her film debut?
I couldn't even wildly guess. I think I watched the theatrical for this.
Mary Elizabeth Winstead.
No way.
No shit. I'm pretty sure that the copy I have is the unrated cut, and I didn't recognize her. I didn't. It wasn't until I was uh, writing notes on this, because I was writing about the mother with Evelyn, and I was like, "That's a strange. Why are we going back? Whatever. Like, I don't care about Evelyn, quite frankly." And then I was like, I'm pretty sure that was Sissy Spacek. I need to look this up. So I look it up, and sure enough, young Evelyn is played by Mary Elizabeth Winstead in her feature film debut. So
Interesting.
who knew? So we have a great cast here that none of them are utilized properly. So
Uh, and let's just make no bones about this whole possession plot is just boring.
incredibly boring. So on a basic level, this film starts off on the right foot, and
Matter
I
of fact, I'll go a step ahead of you and say if you include the little prequel short film, it steps off on even more than the right foot. That was a more interesting idea.
it's a great idea. So for those listeners out there, if you haven't seen it, there is technically a short film that was made as a bridge between The Ring and The Ring 2, which by the way, I should also point out The Ring 2 is spelled out, so it's TWO. So because I get it, because you get the big circle and two that you can use as a ring, whatever. But it's still stupid. So between the prior to the release of this film, they released a short film called Rings, which does not make it at all complicated with the third film being called Rings. But this short film goes into a group of youths that are taking the Ring Challenge, where they watch the tape, record their experiences of almost like a drug. Like all these ghostly things start happening to them. They start recording their experiences, and then they pass off the videotape and they pass off the curse by the seventh day. It's almost like this weird like online chat room experience thing in the
Sure.
early realms of technology.
not the best effect in the world, but one of the scariest moments in the entire Ring franchise in this short film where he vomits up the millipede that's all like staticky and stuff. It's a pretty cool shot.
Yeah, yeah. I noted because I rewatched the short film too prior to watching The Ring 2, and I remember I was like, some of the CGI doesn't work. The millipede doesn't quite work for me. Great idea though. There's a lot of interesting shots. There's a shot in this short film where he's seeing the water drip onto the wall, and
Hmm.
it's obviously shot from an angle, right? So the water's dripping down, and he's just hoisted up so that it looks like he's looking at a wall. But that shot is incredibly well done. I think the editing and stuff is almost feels like a student film in the short film, but the idea is incredibly sound here. And The Ring 2 starts right up where that short film leaves off, including the two characters who end the short film, which are the two characters in this opening sequence where he has been challenged to watch this video. He's trying to get this girl from school who, you get the idea, maybe kind of likes him, and he never gave the time of day to watch this video. You get a great scare sequence with the water and the TV with Samara coming back, and you're like, yes, the
And by
ring is
the
back.
way, intentionally funny and did actually make me laugh when he goes out and goes, "Did you watch the tape?" And she's like, "I covered my eyes the whole time."
I actually wrote that. I wrote that verbatim. This is what she says. I played it. I just didn't look. And she's got her hands over her eyes. It's a great like weird twist for this like little short film that's happening in the beginning of this movie. But this movie starts off on the right foot. That's a really interesting idea, and it's completely dropped by the time they introduce Naomi Watts.
Because
It's
they
literally a
possess
segue.
child movies so bad. And it's like the 70s already happened. Let it go.
Oh, it's and when it becomes a possessed child movie, it's becomes so generic. And don't get me wrong, even the first half of this movie is super problematic. Uh, I would be remiss if I didn't mention the stupid deer scene in the first half of this movie.
You thought the CGI horse was iffy?
These A CGI deer attack on a car in the middle of the road happens in this film. It is completely awkward. It's I get what they're trying to do. They're trying to replicate the horse idea. This idea that animals respond to Samara and her power.
Except that's not what the horse was about. But anyway,
Right, exactly. The horses were scared of her, but the deer become panicked and attack. I don't know. I'm not buying any of this here. And then they try to replicate it when she goes back to the house, but we're going back to the house and she goes into the basement to get more secrets about Evelyn and Samara's mom, real mother. And you see that the basement's full of antlers. So is that the reason? Because the deer sense that
I
Samara's
think that
killed a
was,
lot of deer? Like what the fuck is going on with that?
I don't know, but it's stupid. This movie
It's
is just really stupid. I will say, sorry, skipping ahead to the end a little bit, but one thing I will say is that at least the ending is stupid. No. Basically, she has this dream, and in her dream, they reinforce that Aiden's psychic, and he tells her, drown me, mommy, drown me hard." And um, bearing in mind that she's already had her son repossessed by the government for trying to do this exact move earlier in the movie because they basically lift Wes Craven's New Nightmares wonderful child abuse subplot with nowhere near the skill to do it. Which is sad because again, skilled filmmaker, but boy, this one's a. I wonder if there was like maybe some language difficulties.
Yeah, I think this is his only English language film. But even then, and I've heard this movie had an incredibly troubled production to begin with. But he makes a lot of odd choices in this film, visually speaking and narratively speaking. I mean, the script is bad. Don't get me wrong. The script is terrible. The child possession plot in the second half of the movie, I get it. They're like, we I mentioned this before. The one thing that a remake, if you can't beat the original at its own game, don't don't try it, do something different, right? Well, this movie tries to do something different. Unfortunately, it does something that's so generic and forgettable that nobody's going to give a shit. So that's the big problem with the script. But even Hideo Nakata does some weird things in here. He There's this scene when they go to the flea market or whatever it is, the weird kind of carnival place. They do make a joke about VHS tapes being like no longer valid.
Yeah.
He makes it. He's like, I hear they don't even make those machines anymore. Simon Baker's character does, which is funny because they only just recently stopped making those, like 20 years after this was released. Um, but they go to this area and there's a scene where there's bobbing for apples, and Hideo Nakata makes it a split screen sequence.
Yeah.
And but it's not even like split screen where there's like a bar in the middle and you see two things. It's almost like it's floating heads. It's a weird choice. And then there's even a scene where it's an interesting idea where this scene in the beginning where you get to see it from Samara on the other side of the screen when she's looking at the kid, and then she's coming through the screen. It's from the inside of the TV. Interesting idea. Terribly executed. You're like, what is going on here? I don't understand. And it was like 20 minutes later that I realized that that's what they were doing. I was like well into the movie and I was just so bored that I was thinking back and I was like, what were they doing with that scene? That's when I realized it. But so there's just a lot of weird choices in this film in general, both on a scripting process, on a directing level process. It doesn't even share the same, like we mentioned with The Ring. It has desaturated color. This one doesn't. It's all like a regular color palette, so it almost feels differently than the first one too.
Yeah. No, actively. And Naomi Watts, who is wonderful in the first film, definitely phones this one in. She does not care. Like, I feel like she's over it in this one.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
Um,
It's
and I mean, she's still the central character, so it is a problem. And I mean, it's too bad. I don't think every idea they touch on is bad here, but none of it actually works, and the movie is just dull.
yeah, and
Careless,
it's
lifeless. I mean, it doesn't even have jump scares.
no, and part of that is Hideo Nakata's style. He's not one to do jump scares. One thing I will say is that the scene at the very end where um, Naomi Watts is back inside the well. I'm gonna get to why here in a second because I think it's incredibly stupid. But she knocks. Samara starts coming out of the water. That Hideo Nakata does Samara like he did in the original Japanese, where it's filmed in reverse and it's
Yeah,
the contortionist, which I really like that movement. And I was like, oh, that's a welcome sight because the Ring did not do that. She just kind of walks like a girl with her hair down and things like that. Even when she crawls out of the TV, she's not contortioning through it and filmed in reverse, which gives it that unnerving feel. Um, I think this movie betrays the concept of Samara and the Ring in some ways, and particularly in the third act. Naomi Watts, as you said, this film goes into a little bit of the child abuse subplot, things like that, which, by the way, is the doctor's like, sounds like you had postpartum, so I think you might be unfit to be a mother. And I'm like, really? Like what? Like, are you a doctor or are you just a plot progression at this point? So it's so bad. It's so
that's not.
stupid.
That is not how that works. Everybody gets
No,
postpartum depression.
yeah, it's whatever. We won't even go into why that's such a stupid plot point, but stupid plot point nonetheless. But this movie then focuses on mother theme in this, and while the other movies maybe touch on it a little bit, this one really hammers it home to the point that we go back in time. We look at Evelyn, who is Samara's real mother. We're looking at flashbacks for there. And then the reason for Naomi Watts to go and try to beat Samara at her own game because she gets pulled into the fucking TV in a weird Nightmare on Elm Street like sequence. She gets pulled in the TV and goes into Samara's world or whatever, and she's like, I need to stop her because all she wants is a mother," is the line. And I was like, I feel like you didn't learn anything from the end of The Ring, where you find out that Samara just wants to kill people. She just wants to share her hatred and anger with everybody. She doesn't just want a mother. Like, where did I mean that is literally something in this film that just
They
irritates the
ripped,
shit out of me.
they ripped the end sequence off a New Nightmare too.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah, chasing up the shaft. Yeah, it's literally the same ending.
Yeah, it's literally the same ending. It's irritating on that. It does allow her to deliver the line where she shuts the well. She closes
I'm
the well to trap
not
her.
your
I'm
mommy.
not I'm not your fucking mommy. Great line, great use of the F word to drop it into a
You
PG-13 movie,
know,
but
that's a pretty good F bomb. That's a
yeah.
pretty good F bomb.
Yeah. It's not a warranted one because the theme about mothers in this film does not work at all, and I feel like
Oh,
it betrays
it
the concept.
completely betrays the theme. Actually, that was one of the notes I made. I was like, but it's about motherhood. What
Yeah.
is gonna suddenly be a better mother to Aiden? Like everything about the ending of the movie is like, no, Aiden's just a better child now. Ha 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 ha. Ugh.
Yeah, you drowned him. You're good. Right, right.
Well, that'll teach him to get possessed.
I will say though, the first time when he's in the bathtub and he's panicking, when you kind of discover when the cops come for her because she pushes him down or whatever, and when he pops up and it's Samara said, and she just pushes her down and tries to drown her, like I'd have done the same thing, lady. I'd have been like, if Samara popped up, I'd have been like, I'm gonna drown this ghost. So like, like I unintentionally laughed at that moment because I was like literally like, man, I'd have done the same. So yeah, so
It's definitely strongly do not recommend.
yeah, I'm not sure anybody would recommend The Ring 2. That I don't know if I want to talk about it anymore. I feel like we should just move on with our lives and like the deer, just turn away and walk away from a destroyed car. So I'm just gonna pull a deer here. Just walk away.
Well, I suppose that means we need to talk about 2017's Rings.
Not to be confused with the short film Rings.
2005's Rings, both stylized in lowercase because this isn't all confusing enough.
Fair enough. Now, riddle me this. This is the first film of the American Ring franchise that actually has a title card, right?
Yes.
I think the first two don't have a title card. The original one only shows the ring circle during the DreamWorks logo. Like it flashes it and then it just starts the movie, which I think is a really cool choice. So,
Yep,
side
I
note.
definitely agree. But, and also, this one is not DreamWorks. This is a Paramount release. Not sure specifically what happened. I guess Paramount bought the rights or whatever, but yeah, this is technically this really skirts on remake territory. This only asks you to have a passing knowledge of the first movie at best. Only real strong shout out is that it starts in an airplane bound for Seattle, where someone had watched basically the curse tape and then is on a flight on the last day of this. Brings the whole damn thing down. That has very little to do with the plot of this movie, but is a very thrilling intro, I must say, actually. Samara coming through one of those little TVs on the back panel of a thing. That's actually kind of rad.
And coming through the monitors in the cockpit, you see
Yeah.
like the cockpit door fly open and that
Some
there's
kind of
the
interference. Yeah.
yeah, the well is like on all the screens. I mean, I remember when the teaser trailer, and I know I'm spoiling your synopsis, but I remember when the teaser trailer came out for this movie, that's what they showed was this opening sequence. And I remember being like watching the teaser trailer, being like, "Oh fuck, this is gonna be awesome!" Right? Like, because if you can't beat the first one in like a serious tone, just lean into it. Lean into being like a silly ghost story.
It worked for Final Destination.
Yeah, absolutely. And ironically, it actually works in the Japanese version of Ring, which we'll get to in the third episode, with some of the future episodes when they reboot Ring, and they just kind of lean into the cheesiness of it, and it kind of works. And but we'll talk about that in the future. So
And you didn't tap dance on it too much. That was almost half a joke because that really does have almost nothing to do. Here's the proper synopsis. So basically, there is a college professor who buys an old VCR, happens to have a cursed tape in it, like you do.
happened to me twice.
It immediately jumps time again, and because this is a very time jumpy movie, the first act anyway. And we have a guy going off to college, and we're focusing on his girlfriend who was staying home, and they have this like Skype relationship where they talk every night. Boy, time compresses badly because he pretty much immediately starts ignoring her, saying he's got this really cool college professor. So, not content with being ghosted, she gets this panic call from another girl looking for her boyfriend Holt and decides to just drive 500 miles to Spokane, Washington, where she goes to the college and ultimately discovers an underground club started by Professor Gabriel, which is kind of a large, more controlled experiment version of the Little Rings cult from the previous Rings short film. So it does actually connect that concept down to calling the next person in the cycle a tail. It carried it forward, and it was the most interesting concept that they completely drop a second time in this franchise. Because the actual plot is that Julia, I believe her name is, yeah, Jules. Julia sees the tape. Well, the tape. Now it's a digital file, which, a good move. Um, Sees the digital file and has a different version of the hallucinations than anyone ever has before. And basically, we follow her 7 days as she starts an investigation that, yes, yes, we're adding more to Samara's backstory. Huzzah. An insane priest father who had raped Evelyn, and Samara is the child of that. So wonderful that we're piling on this. Ultimately, however, we discover that all we really needed to do was burn Samara's bones so that she can be put to rest properly and finally get the happy ending she always, no, I'm kidding, ends up possessing Julia and is reborn through her body, and that's the end.
Like, hey, just fast forward through the second half of this movie, like
The
that
movie
we all should
fast
do.
forwards to the second half of this movie. No, actually, it's really just because it's a short synopsis and we can touch on more detail. But one thing I will say is, especially in rewatching this movie, it's significantly better than I remember. It's not a good movie, but there's a lot of good ideas at play here, even when the film kind of craps out.
Hard agree. So I saw this in theaters when it came out, and I remember texting my brother when it came out, and he was like, "Is it as bad as The Ring 2?" And I was like, "Yep, it's as bad as The Ring 2." So, and I haven't seen it since theater. So for the last 3 years, 2 years or whatever, um, I'm not revisited this movie. This is a movie that I sincerely did not like when it first came out. And upon this most recent, I actually watched it earlier today. And upon this most recent rewatch, as I'm watching it, I was thinking to myself, this isn't nearly as bad as I remember it being. Maybe I'm more open. Maybe it's because I had a bad day today and I was just excited to watch a movie.
It's got
But
a lot of the same advantages the first one did. There's only one, well, two especially recognizable actors. Galecki's in this movie for like a sum total 15 minutes, but they got Big Bang Theory to be the professor in this movie.
yeah,
And then Vincent D'Onofrio as the evil priest slash, I guess, grave keeper. I don't know. He runs
slash
the
Samara's real dad.
slash Samara's real dad. Who, in what I find to be a relatively interesting move for a villain in the series, blinded himself to protect himself from Samara's abilities. And it actually works.
There's a lot of interesting ideas going on in this. As you mentioned, I upon this most recent rewatch, I realized I really liked the first act of this movie, and I really liked the last 15 minutes of this movie. And everything else in the middle is kind of a throwaway. There's a lot of weird choices being made. I don't think the cast is particularly strong in this, which is baffling because you do have Galecki, who's actually uh, pretty strong in this film, and Vincent D'Onofrio is always strong in he's always the best part of every film he's in.
Oh, no.
And it's notable that the main girl that plays Julia here is Matilda Lutz, who it wasn't until I was watching it today I realized where I recognized her from. She was just most recently in the rape revenge reclamation film Revenge.
Is that the same girl?
That is the same girl. I know, and she is
Oh,
incredible in Revenge. And
Revenge,
so
so good. Go see Revenge instead.
go
Seriously.
see Revenge instead. I actually just rewatched that because as we're recording this, it is February. It is Women in Horror Month, which I have been very excited about in rewatching a lot of movies directed by women. One of those films was Revenge. And as I was watching that movie, I was like, man, Matilda Lutz is incredible in this movie. She's so good. And then I popped this in and I'm like, she is terrible in this movie. Just goes to show you what a great director can do with a decent star, right? A bad director can make them bad, a good director can make them great. So this cast is relatively interesting in how it goes about it, but there's so many interesting ideas. Like you mentioned, the first third of this movie goes back to the Rings short story about the cult of experimenting and showing this. They do change the videotape to a digital file because at this point, who owns a VHS player? You have to go to a flea market to buy one, or as Galecki's character Gabriel refers to it as vintage. I'm going to put air quotes around that. He says that to the girl. He's like, "It's vintage," like a dick. And you're like, "Okay, that's fine, whatever." So it starts off with this really interesting idea, which is replicating the Rings story that start the Ring 2. The end of this film starts to replicate where the Japanese franchise goes with Sadako 3D and Sadako 3D 2. Samara in this film gets unleashed online, which is a fascinating idea.
It's a strong ending actually, and I having come off this movie a little more positively, actually kind of hope they follow it up. I don't know where the hell you go from there, but apparently the Japanese franchise has already done this too. So
Yeah, they did it for two films, but even the Japanese franchise for Sadako 3D and Sadako 3D 2 kind of drops it. It's initially kind of the major factor for Sadako 3D, and then it also kind of gets dropped. I think they just don't know how to handle it because it is such an open concept.
scenario in a real world, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and for sure. And so that's where they kind of were just like, enough so that after Sadako 3D and Sadako 3D 2, they rebooted the franchise again. So, um, so it's they didn't even know how to handle it properly. So, but it leads to an interesting finale here. I sincerely doubt we're ever getting a sequel to this. We'll just get another reboot if things go the way this movie tanked in the box office. I mean, it did bad. And then I think it's the last time I looked, it had a Rotten Tomato score of 8%, which to be fair was me also. I gave it a very negative review when I first reviewed it when it came out. So enough so that I'm debating even like revisiting this film review wise to maybe make an argument for it as a piece of the franchise. So um interesting ideas galore in this film. I just think the film itself suffers from a lot of mediocre execution.
So I think one of the specific ideas at play here that I actually kind of dug was new movie, new animal, and in this one it's cicadas. This is actually 12 to 13 years after Ring 2, and it's Samara's next attempt to possess someone. So I think the cicada analogy works, and I actually really like that. I'm gonna be honest. I'm not strictly sure that's intentional. I may be giving the movie way too much credit, but it does kind of work. Um,
Well, I think it is. I think to some degree it is intentional because they even in this film showcase that the bugs, because like the previous ones, animals react to Samara and her power, that the bugs are reacting to her power in this place too. They're coming out of the ground, and there's the scene where they're all over the windows and things like that. So I think that's a really interesting idea.
just to touch on Vincent D'Onofrio a little more specifically, terrible story, great character. He really makes this character very frightening, very intimidating. There's a sequence where he turns all the lights out in the house and just goes, I can't see her, but I can hear you, and just like whacks her with his walking stick. And it's just like there's some real good tension there. Don't necessarily love that the solution there was for Samara to just heal his eyes and then suddenly her powers work, because like isn't the whole idea that her powers don't work if he can't see her? I don't know.
It was a stretch. Even the idea of like taking out his own eyes is a stretch because like I don't know. I guess maybe if he didn't see the videotape, but I think that does his arrival as a character in this movie does bring up two points that I have problems with in this film. Number one is that once again we're going much further backwards to try to go forwards again.
Samara's story does not need any more.
Well, and you get this idea that he mentions this is the 12th time she's come after him.
Yeah.
And it makes it seem like less of a general hatred for all of humanity that Samara is, and it becomes a weird revenge film in the last act once it's revealed that he's the dad, and kind of goes into her backstory of what happened to her mother with him. Um, but so I think it betrays the Samara concept once again by trying to add something new to it. But I also think that um, his character's problematic because he doesn't show up till very late. So you mentioned that Galecki as Gabriel the professor is in the first half of this movie, and then he gets really randomly killed in this film. He's like, I'm coming over to help you guys out, and then he dies in a random car wreck. And it's almost like there was two movies they had for the script for this, and they couldn't figure out how to make a complete film out of either one, so they just try to mash them together. So
Add that his specific death scene in this movie is actually really stupid because he grabs her hand but is choking on his own blood, so he like can't say anything to her. And then they run away, and just this utility pole egregiously lands on him, and he gets like electrocuted. And it's just, why not just spare us the whole sequence and say he died in a car wreck? Like you could have cut 5 minutes out of this movie easy, and no one would miss it.
well, and I mean, his character starts off as almost as an antagonist initially, and then there's an interesting turn where he becomes kind of their friend, and then the police get called because somebody died, and he feels guilty about it, and he's gonna kind of run from the cops about it. And I mean, it's
Legitimate laugh in this movie, by the way. The scene where the girl dies and then the kid comes running up the stairs and goes, yeah, I'm supposed to watch a tape.
yeah.
Pretty
Okay,
freaking funny.
legitimate good laugh. I did have a good laugh at that. And actually, the death sequence for I don't know if it was Gabriel's girlfriend or whatever in that first act. Um, her character's name was Sky, but I actually think that that death sequence really works for me, where she like starts tearing all the cords out of the wall, trying to prevent any screen from turning on. Like
Oh,
there's kind of this frantic energy.
and you actually see Samara push herself up out of a screen that's pushed over. That's a really cool effect.
It's kind of a cool effect. The CGI is a little bit questionable at that time, and I think that this
It's a,
movie
well, it's framed well.
it's absolutely framed well, and I actually think the tone for that sequence, like I said, I think the first third of this movie kind of rocks. It's once we get to the Julia watching the tape, watching the video, that this film completely hits the brakes and starts stumbling through, trying to transition from being a cult of Ring movie to another let's investigate Samara's backstory film.
Which, rule of thumb for any Ring movie ever going forward, don't just add shit into the videotape. Like you are not Gore Verbinski.
Yeah, yeah, right. And the new scenes from the videotape don't necessarily work for me. And there's an idea there that the tape is evolving like a virus, which I
Which,
think is
hey, yeah,
cool
and
idea.
like, it was something they were able to add specifically because it's digital now. She's unable to copy it because
Yeah.
Samara chose to possess her, so it just makes it impossible for her version to copy. I thought that was really cool.
Right, because it's like evolved, right? This new version of the tape or of the video, this cursed video. Um, and kind of going back to my point, my original point, Gabriel is killed randomly at the halfway point of this film, and then he's replaced by Vincent D'Onofrio as the new antagonist. And so I almost wanted the two halves of this movie to coalesce a little better. You get the idea in the last 15 minutes where they reveal the big twist of the film, which is that Samara's looking to be reborn. She wasn't taking possession of Julia necessarily to kill her father, but she was looking for a rebirth, which is going back all the way back to the Japanese films for the movie Spiral.
Yeah.
Uh, and you also get the idea that because her and her boyfriend had sex, that the rebirth is actually going to be this baby, which again goes back to Spiral, because that's how the virus was spread in Spiral was the couple having sex. And then she was born as a clone, which goes into that weird fantasy dark science thing, but that's not in this movie.
Great movie though.
Yeah, Spiral's crazy, but you're like, it's a good kind of crazy. This movie starts touching on those points in the last 15 minutes, and I was like, fuck, this is the movie I wanted to see. Take out all of this backstory stuff and give me the first third of this movie leading into this ending.
Make Galecki the out and out villain and just focus it on like a cult springing up. Because the other thing is, the reason I get so frustrated that they keep not really leaning into that idea is tell me, tell me that we find some objective proof of the supernatural and a religion doesn't build around it. That's an interesting idea.
Incredibly interesting idea, and now we've dropped it twice in this franchise. In 3 films, we've come up with this idea twice and dropped it both times.
It's
And
okay. So if you ever really, really want to see that concept play out, watch the Death Note movies, the live action ones. They're actually pretty good.
Yeah, I actually really do. I've seen those ones, and that's actually a series that would be fascinating to analyze. Getting back to Rings, I really do. I think that this movie might be a little underrated. I'm going to say it. I'm going to say it straight.
No, revisiting it, I actually think it's a little underrated. It's even better than a couple of the Japanese sequels I've sat through so far.
Yeah. Oh, you just wait till we get to the next portion of this franchise.
But I mean, I don't want to speak like overly positive on it. This is not a good movie.
No. It's just better than I remember it being.
Just ideas. It is scarier than Ring 2, even though that's a low bar. But I obviously nowhere near the original. But again, not overly dependent on jump scares. Some actually really creepy visuals right after she watches her version of the file. She looks outside and it's raining upside down, and that's a really, really cool looking thing.
Absolutely, that sequence is really cool. And then when the lightning flashes in the windows, you see the well. It's
Yeah.
like the white static of the well in that sequence. This director really hasn't done a whole lot of movies. I wanted to say that this movie pretty much killed his career. He hasn't done anything since,
He's
at
really
least not according to his IMDb.
he did like one other movie. He's got a bunch of like Mexican short films to his name.
Right. And this was the last film he did. But even then, the film before this was 2008 as
Yeah.
a director. So, I mean, and he hasn't done anything. This is the kind of film when you get an 8% on Rotten Tomatoes and that kind of box office, it'll pretty much kill your career in Hollywood. But
F. Javier Gutierrez, by the way, the man's name.
oh, yes, Gutierrez. I mean, there's moments where he does kind of embrace this cool visual, including the final 15 minutes even the sequence where she starts coughing up the hairball and then she wipes the mirror and you see Samara's face in the mirror. That's a pretty good jump scare there right at the end of the film. Um, I just think he has a lot of trouble with a script that doesn't know what it wants to be ultimately, and then
Am I?
creating a cohesive tone.
I mean, we mentioned they dropped the thread of the far more interesting cult idea, but like, am I crazy or does this actually feel like 2 or 3, maybe 4 scripts that got Frankenstein together?
Absolutely, it totally does. And I remember in my review when I first wrote about this film, that's what I had mentioned is like this is a movie that doesn't know what film it is.
Yeah,
It just keeps throwing things at the audience,
and
just
that's
seeing what they react to.
if you're ever gonna say one thing about a director's job, because I know it's kind of an esoteric position, but one thing that is the director's job is cohesive vision, and that it just doesn't feel like this had one.
Yeah, and I feel like he tries. I just think the script is that problematic in it that your best efforts can only make a passable film versus one that actually is elevated.
I mean, again, for what it's worth, the airplane sequence is really good. First act is really strong, and like you said, I'll even give it to a little more than the last 15 minutes because I think there's a lot of good stuff in the kind of fight slash kind of attack of Vincent D'Onofrio, even if the story and character and context around it's a little silly. The moment in and of itself is very intense. D'Onofrio is a guy that throws himself 100% into everything, and it still shows even in something as frivolous as this.
For sure. I actually think that sequence is really well shot. And it just feels like it's in a different movie.
And it's the same reason they chose him for the Kingpin in Daredevil. It's easy to forget, but he is a physically imposing dude too. He's like 6'4".
I mean, he's a good actor in everything he does. I mean, he even shows up on a stupid monitor in Sinister as the pagan demon specialist or whatever for 5 minutes or whatever, and you're like, son of a bitch, he owns this role too.
Oh,
Like,
actually, he was the villain in probably my favorite non-genre film ever, which is The Salton Sea with
mm,
yeah.
good choice, good choice. I applaud that one. So I gotta know, what do you believe the seven means in Rings?
I know it's really easy to call out the surface layer of it, which is obviously 7 days. Um, but and yeah, but it's only
It's a
considered a
weird choice.
it's nowhere in like Samara's backstory in any particular way, outside of at this point, I guess she's got like seven parents.
Fair enough. Yeah, she literally does. And what's funny is they bring it up a lot in the first third of this movie, and then it like weirdly gets dropped again. And it makes you wonder if it was again part of a different script where it's supposed to mean something more.
Mhm.
Um, I mean, you can say because they referred to the club as the Sevens Club, and I'm not sure if that's in reference to the fact that it's on the seventh floor of that building. And when she pushes the button, there's two sevens there. There's a seven next to the seven.
Yeah.
So Sevens Club. If the club was started for the ring purpose as a cult because of the 7 days, so you're a sevens person. But even like when she wakes up in the morning with her boyfriend when they introduce the two main characters, the clock is 7:07.
No shit.
Yeah,
Funny.
noticed it on this round. That's what
You
the
know,
clock
it's
says.
such a major theme in the movie, but the cicadas don't actually show up until about halfway through.
It's a complete that's the whole story. It feels like that there's two movies here. There's the cult movie with Galecki, and then there is the backstory with the preacher and Vincent D'Onofrio's the second half. And the only thing that really connects them is that last 15 minutes.
Which should mention we obviously always dive straight into spoilers here, but what do you think of the whole like 20 minutes we're pretending that Vincent D'Onofrio is not the villain of this movie?
It's a plot progression point as far as I'm concerned. I mean, I'm not sold on it. As soon as he shows up and you're like, "Oh, he's a blind man." You're like,
Well, it's like when you what's the meme I just saw the other day? It's like when you're watching Law and Order, and it's like, well, I wonder who did it. Wonder if it's the A-list actor we have guesting in this episode.
yeah, right, exactly. And so when he shows up, you're like, "Yeah, he's definitely involved in some major way, right?" I don't know if I necessarily thought he was going to be like a straight up like serial villainous rapist killer, but hey,
Although I will say, as far as awkward information and exposition goes, you don't get much more than like creepily sitting next to the lady at the Denny's and being like, "So, you remember that lady you didn't want to talk about earlier? Let's talk about her."
yeah, and then the lady just opens up about her.
Like, what is that? That is lazy writing, and just, I mean, her character name may as well have been blatant exposition lady.
I kind of hope it is. I should look up the casting for this. Blatant exposition lady. No, yeah, and I think that that's the main problem with this movie is that literally the transitions between its scenes and story beats and narrative is just it's all over the place. And
Yeah, because it's like the script asks you to make logical leaps that are almost impossible because it's not the sci-fi and it's not the horror of it. It's none of the fantasy or fantastical elements. It's the human interactions are what don't work even a little bit. When Sky's begging her to watch the tape, it's like, "Oh, I'll take you to your boyfriend. I just need you to watch this video first." And it's like, does Julie have stupid tattooed across her forehead. What? Except she was gonna watch the video, so there you go.
Yeah, yeah. It's and even then, I would be almost tempted, as you mentioned, that it feels like it's like 4 or 5 scripts all stitched together. I would I would venture to guess that the second half of this movie was a different, not a Rings script, was a different script that was put in because there's elements in this film that, like when she goes into the graveyard and she finds all the like her name is carved into the stone underneath or whatever. And there's an interesting visual cue where she looks at her phone and she sees a chain. And then when she drops her phone, she sees her hand is chained, and then the chain starts dragging her. You've never really seen that kind of a ghost scare in these movies before that's quite like that.
Actually, I think the entire cemetery sequence is like notably good in this movie. When she climbs into that grave, for one, you're just like, what are you doing?
Right.
Why would you do that? But like when she looks and it's like scratching to the wall, I knew you'd find me, and then it's like her name Julia, and it's like, okay, that's a really good creep. Like,
Incredibly good. I just don't know if it's this movie. I
no,
feel like that's from a different movie. Just like I feel like that there's a lot of things stitched together here, like you mentioned. So it makes it it makes it fascinating because I think you're right. There's a lot of individual sequences that work in this. It's got a lot of the right pieces, just not a lot of the right pieces in the right places.
you know what I think? I think they need to take this franchise the same direction I think they need to take the Jurassic Park franchise. Uh, Military. Vincent D'Onofrio. Because Vincent D'Onofrio pitches in Jurassic World, Raptors on the battlefield, and I'm like, that's a movie I want to see. And it, I don't even know when it occurred to me while I was watching Rings, but I'm like, could you imagine like someone in the military being aware of this and using it as enhanced interrogation technique, forcing someone to watch the tape? I think there's like a really cool idea in there. Hollywood, call me.
Call me. Call me. Also, Raptors on the Battlefield. Where's my Dino Riders movie? I want it now.
I do, right?
Dino
You
Riders.
remember the 90s, just that golden era of dinosaur movies?
Damn right. I'm still a Carnosaur fan. I
Uh,
actually just watched Tammy and the T Rex for the first time the other day. The gore cut.
Hey, oh, yeah, I want to see that. I haven't seen that yet.
All right. So I guess that kind of wraps up Rings. I guess why don't we jump into talking about
I
this
know in
version.
theory we would say that we're talking about the themes of this franchise, but oof, for one, these are three separate islands of movies. So, like, we went into a pretty good thematic conversation for the first one. Um, the rest of them are pretty scattershot, and I'm kind of brushing by Ring Virus because that's so similar to the Japanese one. We really mostly touched on it for completion's sake, but thematically, it should have been in the Asian ones actually.
Absolutely, for sure. That's one of them that, you know, in terms of theme, it because we're talking about 3 different remakes of the same film, that we're going to have at least some kind of thematic element that's just based on that.
Yeah.
I think you're right for a franchise, the American franchise, when you talk about The Ring, The Ring 2, and Rings. It's amazing at how much each one drops the ball in terms of trying to thread the themes through. And in fact, like even Rings, as we mentioned with the cult and how the video is now online by the end of the movie, that the fear of technology, which was such a strong theme through a lot of the Japanese films, was a fear of like advancement of technology and how people can't keep up with that or understand it, is almost completely dropped. It's completely dropped essentially by The Ring 2 for the Possession film. And then even Rings, although it starts off with this cool idea of putting it online, it's also almost completely dropped. So even like a strong theme about fear of technology isn't carried through in all 3 of these films.
And the second one is almost the funniest one to try and talk about in any kind of thematic sense because, as you mentioned, in the proper section. All three of these do have a vague motherhood theme. It's inherent to the franchise that carries through the Japanese ones as well. But the second American Ring movie is almost the most on the nose about it, except it's the worst possible example because it is the one with all of the worst mothering in the entire franchise worldwide.
It's yeah, the motherhood aspect of it is an interesting one, particularly because we get so many mother characters between Naomi Watts' character or the fact that Samaro's got like 15 moms at this point. You get a lot of interesting motherly characters. And then even at the end of Rings, the idea that perhaps Julia is the mother of a new Samara is an interesting concept for a rebirth versus
Yeah,
possessing a little kid.
I did take the ending as Julia was turning into Samara because she peels that piece of skin off and it's like gross
Right.
old Samara skin underneath.
I think the idea is it's supposed to be like Spiral.
Which, yeah, I mean,
I mean, bold choice. Where it's like I'm pregnant with the rebirth of Samara, and then it's like a weird clone that takes over for you. So,
yeah. But all that said, yeah, no, there's very little in theming. So truly, the consistent stuff here is more in terms of types of scares. They really kind of pull from the same hat over and over again. You show a scary face on Michelle Trachtenberg once in the first movie, and all of a sudden, you just think the scary face is enough, and it's really not. Honestly, it's kind of a silly effect. Rings does it the best. I actually think Sky looked really gross,
yeah. No,
especially the dude she finds in the car in Ring 2. Um, oh, that's a bad one.
yeah.
Like I actually laughed.
Yeah, there's and maybe it's because Hideo Nakata, his style is to not show things, just
Mhm.
to indicate things that when he's asked to make an American film where he's required to show things, he doesn't know how. I don't know, maybe that's it.
Because everything about how it's
Um,
framed is weird too. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, I'm not. Maybe that's just not his style, and he was kind of forced into it. Because a lot of his other films I've ever seen, if you've ever seen like Kaiden or any of those, he's incredibly good at doing horror movies over in Japan. He just happened to make a really terrible one here in the U.S. So, um, I mean, it's an interesting theme, particularly because you are pulling a lot from you're translating a lot from Japanese folklore for the scares into an American style scare. Um, it just shows you the strength of Gore Verbinski as a director of horror movies, that he was able to do that translation. That's where the Ring 2 and Rings fail, is I think that translation between the folklorish idea of Samara and the actual scares just don't coalesce.
Because they keep trying to. I think you're exactly right. It's the translation doesn't work anymore because the first one is translating, the other two are trying to shove this quintessentially Japanese story into an American box, and yeah, without incredibly deft hands, it doesn't work.
Yeah, I just don't think it works. Now, there is something about this franchise I did want to bring up thematically that, and I've kind of mentioned it briefly in discussions of all three of the films, but I do want to bring it up as a whole that I think is unique to this one that is not in the Japanese ones, and that is this idea that Samara is a force of nature,
Mm.
that she's almost like this unstoppable force that's been created by mankind's arrogance and mankind's viciousness towards each other and
Which
all of our faults.
I do think is an inherently American spin to put on it. And I mentioned earlier being super into slashers. This isn't wildly unlike a Jason Voorhees or a Michael Myers. More personality, so I guess more of a Freddy Krueger, but well, she doesn't talk, so I'm gonna go back to Jason Voorhees. Um, she's like a slightly less mutant zombie Jason Voorhees.
I think that's a relevant comparison to make because the American franchise definitely made her into an iconic figure in terms of the long black hair and everything. Even if she was even if that's an iconic Japanese look from that series, the Americans kind of
We
made that a look.
Yeah, we wouldn't call it a yokai look.
Right.
We call it a ring look because that is how we see it.
Exactly. And comparing her to Jason Voorhees is interesting because even that Jason Voorhees in the Friday the 13th movies becomes a force of nature. He becomes like this inevitable death to all those whatever. And Samara's that way. And I think it's interestingly paralleled between the horses and the deer and the locusts and the bugs and in all of these films. And even more so in these films, the way that water is used, like this water is like this unstoppable, like once it gathers momentum, it can create this force. That water is this theme that comes through that we talked about with the Japanese films, that water is one of the major themes. But instead of like this idea of that water being a thing of life and death, and this one it's a theme, it's like almost like this unstoppable force, like you just can't stop water. And so all
And
these movies really kind of double down on that, and I think that's a fascinating theme to
no,
handle.
never even occurred to me. But tying straight into that is first and third movie kind of replay that snippet of an interview with Samara while she's alive, where she says, "I can't make it stop." Um, yeah, that's a good point. And by the way, incredibly creepy. Should have used way more of that little girl. She's awesome. We
she's
never mentioned it, but she's so good.
she's awesome, and those flashback scenes always work for me, with her interview and whatnot. I think that really works. But yeah, she's unstoppable, and even Brian Cox talks about she never sleeps, she never stops, she's just like this thing that just keeps going. um, and even to an extent, I think that in modern times, the movie like It Follows utilizes a lot of these concepts in a much better way than so many of the Rings films do, about this kind of unstoppable force that, once you're infected with it, in that case it's a sexually transmitted haunting, an STH if you will.
Hmm.
But um, in this one it's being watching the videotape, and it's through technology. But I think it makes for a really interesting idea to view her as a force of nature. And I get to see why that she's become kind of an icon for that reason. And it's on this most recent rewatch that I really, really started to pick up on those threads between the films that way as a franchise.
And just gonna give a shout out to the short film one more time because I don't know why none of these movies outside of the first one and 2005 Rings ever play on the idea of desperation to get someone else to watch the tape. Once once you realize that's how you do it, and more specifically in that short film, because that's literally the plot of it, like how is that never, even beyond the cult and that cool interesting idea, how has that never been the key plot point of one of these, is even trying to get someone to sit down and watch something for 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Like, because it's not something you can just trick someone into. Like, they have to watch it for 2 full minutes, and that I think is an interesting dilemma that I'm shocked none of these movies have ever played with more.
Yeah. And in a more recent time period, I guess maybe that's something that an audience wouldn't relate to, because if I just texted somebody a link to a video, if I ripped a video, put it under a private YouTube channel and just linked somebody to it and be like, "Hey, watch this," they totally would. I don't know if if I would have
Yeah,
trouble finding somebody.
circles you and I run in, because you also got to remember the average person gets 30 seconds into that and they're like, just turn it off.
Yeah.
Because like there's inherently no narrative to it. There's nothing
Yeah.
really drawing you through this video.
Yeah, that's true. I'll give you that. So, I mean, I'm drawn to this video.
Oh,
I guess
certainly.
like
I'd be patient zero.
um, I also read that the tape version that Gore Verbinski made, that in the marketing process of that they would like in the movie theaters they would leave blank tapes with that video on it for patrons,
That's pretty
for like
cool.
test audiences and stuff. And then
You
um
downloaded screensaver too. I used to just pop it up at my buddy's house every once in a while to freak him out.
Yeah, that's great. That would freak me out. It's like playing the Halloween theme song in an empty house. Um, Sorry, won't go in.
Not even the main theme, the dee 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 dee
Yeah,
dee dee.
yes.
The
Oh,
slow one, like when Lori's walking around the house. Yeah, no,
yep.
that is creepy
Nope.
shit.
Nope. Not doing it. So, and then from what I gather, like the original VHS, and I'm trying to remember back because I know I owned this on VHS. I just don't know if this is what it was. But the original VHS copy of this, the first pressing, um, when you put in the VHS tape of it, it played Sadako's video first
That's funny.
in its entirety, and then the movie would start.
And you remember when they used to do stuff like that on VHS?
Yeah. Well, it would play the video in its entirety, and then it would go black, and then you would hear a phone ring twice.
Mhm.
I want one of those VHS copies for my collection.
Even slightly recent memory that I can think of like that is I don't know if you ever got that the Fight Club Blu-ray, the special edition, but when you initially put it in, it pops up the menu screen for Never Been Kissed.
Oh yes, yes.
Melts into the Fight Club. That's a pretty good gag.
Yeah, it's a super good gag. So, um, hiding that stuff in there. Actually, speaking, there's an interesting thing with Fight Club. I guess Gore Verbinski in the first film actually puts in cutscenes of just the ring, of the black with the white ring, like frames of it in
That's
the
cool.
movie. And I'm like, you sucker. He's just a good director. But yeah, so that's kind of wraps up the themes that I wanted to talk about. Any other ones you want to talk about before we rank these?
I mean, it's not so much a theme as just saying this definitely feels like it should have fallen under a creepy children kind of theme, except they make Samara so like weirdly ageless as a monster that it doesn't work on that level. Like, you know, when you see the interviews with the little girl, that's one of the reasons it really works. There's just something creepy about creepy children. But as soon as you see her crawling out of the, you know, screen, like they never even imply she's younger than 30, really.
Well, yeah, and you get the idea that she's almost like not a person anymore.
Yeah. Which, I mean, is cool for Americanizing it, but you do lose that. And they try to kind of pick it up with Aiden a little bit, but it just doesn't work out. Also, I think, you know, if I'm comparing the ring, or if I'm comparing Samara's makeup to Reagan face, it just occurred to me that Aiden is remembering the era, basically Haley Joel Osment from Sixth Sense.
Yeah. Well, and actually, that's another thing that I had read was that The Sixth Sense was the reason they greenlit this movie to be made.
I don't doubt that for a second. That was another PG-13 horror that actually worked.
Yep. Yeah, because Sixth Sense came out in like what, 99? So
Yeah.
um they had bought the rights to Ring. DreamWorks, one of the producers at DreamWorks, had bought the rights to Ring after somebody told him, "Oh, you have to go see this in theaters." So he went and saw it in theaters and immediately bought the rights to it. But really couldn't get the money to back it until Sixth Sense was a huge hit.
Hmm.
And then they were like, "Oh, elevated horror," which has been a thing for years and years and years, and not a new term that everyone needs to jump on. But
And also, it was never a good term in the old days either. Let's just abdicate the phrase altogether.
yeah, it's just a good movie. Let's just
Yeah.
good horror is
It's
good
like
horror.
people say elevated horror like it's a genre, and it's like, no, motherfucker, fucking It Follows is still a ghost movie,
Yeah,
just a really good one.
yeah, right, exactly. You're like, it's just really well done. Just leave it be at that. So
Midsommar's basically a remake of The Wicker Man, the good one.
yeah, Midsummer. I need to rewatch that one too. That's one I haven't seen since theaters.
Just
So
had it on the other night before I passed out. It's pretty good.
pretty good, pretty good movie to pass out to. You know, hey.
I don't dream, so it's fine for me.
Oh yeah, same here.
You
Same here.
know,
I don't really dream very often. So all
any,
right, let's
uh,
rank these guys.
uh, this is gonna be kind of a funny ranking because poor Ring Virus, you definitely deserve a little better than this. But
You're right.
for me, between these four, the best is very obviously The Ring, and the worst with a bullet is Ring 2.
Yep, I'm gonna have to agree with you on both accounts. The Ring is the best one. Although I would say The Ring Virus is a very close second for me.
Very close second. It's actually I was actually gobsmacked by how good this movie was, especially for the time. For 99 Korean cinema, this is really solid stuff.
Yeah, it's right around the time when Korean cinema was starting to get that boost
Yep.
in kind of that artsy genre boost that was going to happen. And I think it's incredibly good, and I really do wish it had a better release.
It's right around Sympathy for Mr. Vengeance also, right?
Yep, would have been right around that time. So
Yep.
yeah, for sure, for sure. So yeah, I think we're on agreement. The Ring is the best of them, and The Ring 2 is the worst. Such a fascinating way to think that Hideo Nakata would make the worst Ring film after
And
making,
your
as far as
opinion.
I'm concerned, the best Ring film.
Yeah,
So
that's funny. Well,
that's it.
yeah, I think that about does it for The Ring Part 2.
Yeah. Well, well, well.
Well,
I
well,
think we should go with well, well, well. I
I'm
think that's a good one. Yeah, we should go for that one for
the
title.
I think the real curse tape is the friends we made along the way. I don't
Yes,
know.
that is the worst curse tape. You know, that's trust me. Some of the friends I make, I very well could see them killing me in 7 days. So that's awesome. So yeah, I mean, you know what? Or maybe we should do something with like well done.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Well, eh. um, thank you, listeners, for following us down the well once again.
yeah. Heading down the well, we got to climb our way out like all jankety and stuff. So
Mhm.
we're we're gonna make our way out. So yeah, yeah. So get your fingernailless fingers into those rocks and start climbing with us. But please, everyone out there, please remember to go rate, review, and subscribe to No Franchise Fatigue wherever you listen to your podcast, whether it's Spotify or over at our host site Anchor. .fm. Please go subscribe to us. We would love to hear from you if you have anything to say. Let us know what you think about the American Ring franchise. Let us know if you've even seen the South Korean one. I want to hear how many people have actually seen that movie. That would be really kind of cool to get an idea of if
Everyone I've
that's
listened it to in the last couple of days has been like, "What?"
yeah, what no, truthfully, it's always something I bring up and everyone's like they remade it in South Korea. What? Um So I'm really curious about that. So we want to hear from you guys. Please let us know if how you would rank these films. If you have a favorite out of these that you want to talk about, maybe chat with us a little bit about that. If you like what we do here, please tell your friends, share us on social media. Go check out our back catalog. We are getting a pretty extensive back catalog of both No Franchise Fatigue episodes and also episodes of our sister podcast called The Good, the Bad, the Weird, the Wild, which is a great podcast dedicated to cinematic figures. You can also find us on facebook.com/no franchise fatigue or over at Twitter using the handle at NFFpod. We just want to hear from you guys. Also, if you have any suggestions for future episodes, we want to hear from you. Please let us know. Our Charlie's Angels episode is looks like it's doing surprisingly well. That was a fan requested episode, so I'm excited to have that on there. So if there's something you guys want to see, we've already gotten some requests for some other stuff, so we'll try to get that onto our schedule as soon as we can. Yeah, that's kind of all I got. Anything else you want to add, Sean?
You can always hit me at nffpod.sean at gmail.com. You can reach us at Twitter and Facebook under the No Franchise Fatigue if you search for us. And what are we doing next time, Matt?
Oh my goodness, let me pull up our schedule. What do we have going on next time? You know what? I am very excited for our next or no. Wow. I'm very excited for our next No Franchise Fatigue episode because it is one of low key my favorite franchises of all time, even though I'm not even sure there is a good entry into this franchise.
When we started talking about doing the series, the initial pitch was always to be doing older franchises, and we're finally doing one.
Yeah, finally one that you can probably find, which you know what's really funny? So I should probably state what franchise we're talking about. We're talking about American Ninja.
If you want to get your Michael Dudikoff on.
Oh wow, that was. I'm sorry. Did you pull your calf stretching for that joke? I think you did. that was such a stretch. That was an incredible stretch. But yes, we are doing we are doing American Ninja for our next episode. So please, if you get a chance, there are 5 of these. We're not talking American Ninja Warrior on TV. No, we're talking the canon franchise.
It's something. It is
It's
something.
it is something. I will say American Ninja 2, The Confrontation might be one of my most watched movies I've ever seen. I've seen that movie 1,000 times. My brother and I used to watch that on repeat on VHS. We would just sit there and watch that movie. Oh God, I love it so much. So there are 5 of those movies, so definitely make sure you check those out. I don't know if they're regularly available on any streaming platforms at this time. I know I do have a nice Blu-ray set from over in the UK, courtesy of 88 Films, of the first 4 films, and I do know that the 5th film is available for streaming on Vudu as free with ads. I just added it to my list for us to watch. So, American Ninja is our next one. So, yes. So, our next episode of No Franchise Fatigue will be on the American Ninja franchise. We will be covering all 5 films in one episode. So, please make sure you wear diapers because it's going to be a long one. We'll try not to make it too long, I guess. And in the meantime, please keep watching your franchises, support your remakes, your reboots, your sequels, your prequels, your remakequels, whatever the thing is. A remake will sequel reboot.
No,
It's
no, no,
all
no.
of them in one.
You're getting
Whatever.
Dikembe Mutombo. No, 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 no. On
No,
the
no, no, no,
on the
no, no, no.
thing. No, 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 no.
Let's not go there. All right. Thank you guys for listening. We will see you next time